Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's Tuesday, which means only one thing. It's Scottish night on the Restore UK podcast. And tonight, finally, I've tracked him down and he's joined us. It's the elusive, the one, the only Dr. John Stanley. John, good evening.
Good evening, David.
So, yes.
Finally made it. Ran out
of excuses, not too good. Yeah. Indeed. So no, this is just a bit of gentle jibing, guys. It's all good. John is an ex-colleague of mine and a good friend, and he's going to tell us all about himself. John, have your 30 seconds. Tell us all about Dr. John Stanley.
Right. Well, I'm a qualified doctor, but I've been involved in politics for quite a few years now. My background politically is that I'm a senior researcher for the Bow Group, which is the UK's, I think, the world's oldest conservative think tank. I write reasonably regularly for Think Scotland. I've worked in the European Parliament for two members of that Parliament before we left, and increasingly I'm involved in what I would call mainstream unionism. Although in Scotland that's almost a fringe movement at the moment, but it's a long-term project to kind of really bring big U unionism back to Scotland. It used to be a very big force before the 1960s, before Edward Heath messed it up, as he messed up a lot of things. But when you look at what's happened since 2014, the so-called unionist parties in Scotland really have drifted quite badly away from preserving the United Kingdom, and I think are actually one of the biggest threats to it.
It's a phrase I hear regularly, often from people in the same line. So tell us how you got into politics in the first place, then, John. What attracted you to this strange and murky world?
The main thing really was to do with, first of all, it was being against the Labour Party. From my background of being in healthcare and seeing what a very centralised, very uncaring state does to the medical profession and to patients, and that stays with me. I fundamentally disagree with the idea of a very, very large political force in medicine. But from then, one of the biggest factors affecting healthcare was the European Union, and I think you can work out where the next steps took me. It was about asking myself, how can we achieve the conditions for leaving the European Union? I mean, the referendum seems a long way away now, but when I joined UKIP in 2012, the referendum still was not on the cards. And it was really only in 2015 where we had a realistic prospect of a referendum.
Wow.
So the road is long. The road is long in whatever you do in politics, unless you want to make a quick buck out of it. But if you actually want to do things rather than be someone, it's a long journey, but worth it.
Sure. Wow, so interesting indeed. So what brought you to Scotland?
It was to study at university again. So I was working in a lab in microbiology and cancer research. That's what I was working on. That's actually taken me down a completely different avenue away from politics. I've learned from my microbiology and a lot of my genetics on how to deal with yeasts, and particularly how to make yeasts do nice things like make beer. So yes. My passion increasingly over the last few years has been what some people would call craft brewing, but really it's just brewing, but it's brewing a different type of beer. And obviously when I was in Brussels for a year, and so obviously I'm going to enjoy drinking Belgian beer. So that's one of my big focuses right now.
Fantastic. So you're making the stuff and selling it then?
I will be. So I'll be opening a microbrewery very soon. And one of the colleagues that I had in the lab in Edinburgh is now in a yeast lab in America. And we've actually developed a brand new yeast. But it's a mixture of a Scottish yeast, and it's a mixture of another Scottish yeast, which is now being used in Belgium. We brought the two together, put them in a big tank, let them get on with things, and we've come back and we've got a brand new yeast, and it's great.
Good for you. Very good. Wonderful.
All good fun.
So the question has to be asked then, what's going to happen in May? What will your involvement be in May? Because you've got another little political hat that you wear sometimes also, haven't you? And
well,
you can, tell us about that.
I think one of the big challenges for unionism is accepting what unionism is. And it's really a reaction. It's a reaction to the threat of nationalism in our country. If you go to Germany or France or Sweden, you don't have unionists because you don't need them. They are a united country, and they really don't have any truck with regional separatists. There aren't many countries in the world that do. We've entertained them far more than most. But one of the problems we've had since 2014 is that the main unionist party, if you like, the Tories up here, have tried to make everything about independence and about having a second independence referendum, where realistically, they're the only party that can grant that in Westminster anyway. So they're kind of playing blackmail, really. And one of the worries I have is that they want to keep the SN vote high because they want to suppress the Labour vote, because what they really care about is government in Westminster. And in one sense, you can understand that. But the truth is that whether it's the Tories or Labour or the Lib Dems, they all would rather the SNP be in power than work together to be in government, which I have a big problem with because, time is not standing still. The SNP in power have access to a huge amount of money. They can employ very, very large numbers of people sympathetic to them in the public sector and in the third sector, which is even worse. Whether it's the chief medical officer or some scientific advisor or some head of outreach for veterinary science at Glasgow, you know every single time as time goes on, the people that are being put into place are nationalists, they're very overt nationalists. And you see this thing almost, going back to my medical days, almost spreading like a cancer, kind of inserting a little claw, a little tentacle into every part of civil society. And the only way you can deal with that is to realize the true problem. The true problem is we have a regional government that we need to get rid of. That's it. No big referendums to talk about or threaten. It's just about doing whatever needs done to remove the SNP from power. And that's really the big challenge.
Just trying to make the microphone from.
Just got mute for a second there.
I did, yeah. I'm just trying to stop my microphone from echoing. See what this is like. Hang on. Sorry about this. I'm just trying to see if I can stop this microphone from echoing. Can you hear me okay now, John?
I can hear you all right, yeah.
That's great. Okay, sorry about this, guys. Right, okay. We'll crack on like this for now. Okay, good. Oh, sorry. So, yeah. No, you're absolutely right in what you say. The tentacles are reaching far and deep. And this is my concern, and it was my concern last year, in fact, 18 months ago, when we started thinking about All for Unity. And just for those of you who don't know, John was a colleague of mine. He also stood for election last year with All for Unity. Right at the outset, I can remember speaking to my Conservative MP at the time, and saying, you're not aware of the potential constitutional crisis which is looming if you carry on with the Conservatives government in Westminster saying, no, you're not getting the referendum. Meanwhile, the SNP continue to win every election by some distance. Can't you see that's going to strain the Constitution if you just keep saying no and leaving it at that? Shouldn't you maybe try to do something else? And I think you're quite right. I think that you see now that there are vast areas of Scottish public life where you can tell that the nationalist influence pervades. Medicine being one, for example. We all know that Hugh Pennington was shamefully excluded from any decision making in the pandemic, although he's the leading epidemiologist in the UK. And instead, we've had Jason Leach, who's a dentist, and we've had the absolutely bizarre spectacle of Devi Sridhar, who's a Canadian or American, who's pontificating to the Scottish public and placing herself right at Nicola Sturgeon's right hand. And she makes the most outrageous
anti-UK, pro-nationalist statements every now and again. So it really is quite ludicrous. But a lot of people are starting to say exactly what you've said tonight, John, which is the biggest threat to the union is, in fact, the Conservative Party and the other pro-UK parties. So how do you see that panning out? I mean, you've been involved in politics a long time. How do you think this is all going to go in the next few years? What's your view?
I think the most obvious trend is that things will slowly get worse. And that tends to be the default option if you don't do anything. What won't happen is we won't just carry on treading water as we are, because we've already seen a very senior journalist and the daughter of a Labour leader effectively sent into exile. You know, that's what's happened to Sarah now.
Yeah.
And we've had the legal profession under attack, to the extent that very senior legal minds in this country are now openly challenging the Scottish government. And we kind of need to wake up to that when professions are saying, hang on a second, we're not meant to be political, but this is really bad what they're doing. They are taking over our professions, which means, if you think about it, if you have a government that's able to effectively nationalize its own legal profession, it can literally do what it wants, because it will just simply make the law up as it goes along. And that's a very, very dangerous place that we're entering. What's quite infuriating is that the British government is happy to sit back and go, yeah, this is fine. This is all fine. It's like that cartoon meme, isn't it? You know, the little dog on the chair in the bar, and the whole pub is in flames, and he's just sat there with his little cup of tea going, this is fine, which seems to be where the Scotland office is. There's a lot more that can be done right now to actually rein in some of these excesses by the Scottish government. They're only pushing as far as they can because there's no resistance to them.
Yeah,
if there's resistance, they'd have to slow down.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, it's a very interesting picture you're painting in terms of the Conservative Party actually wanting the SNP to stay in government in Scotland. I think we all saw this time last year, all for unity. George Galloway was the visionary guy. He came up with the idea of the three main pro-UK parties standing together, forming a government of national unity. And they weren't interested. Not one of the parties showed any interest. Very late on, Douglas Ross paid some lip service to it and said, "Oh yeah, we'll do whatever it takes." But you get the feeling that it wasn't really meant. And also, they didn't offer the. Yeah, quite exactly. And we saw anyway. There was no unilateral attempt on Ross's part to stand down candidates, with the result that in East Lothian, for example, Labour lost the seat, and the third place Conservative constituency candidate took 9,000 votes, which would have been enough 6 times over to help the Labour candidate win the seat. So it's very easy to say, "Oh yes, my door's open" and all this. It wasn't at all. They weren't interested in working together with the Labour Party. And what we see now is very clearly, we see that the Labour Party certainly isn't interested in working with the Conservatives in Scotland. So it's very difficult to see how this is ever going to end, unless
I think the way it ends is that you start the conversation with the Scottish people, and that conversation is, these people do not want to work together. They'd rather things get worse than work together. And that's actually quite hard for people to take, because they get all the election literature, they get all the leaflets, and they really buy into this thing that actually it's the Tories that are stopping us getting a referendum. Well, no, it's not going to happen anyway. They're just talking it up to talk the gnats up. And I think the first stage, and this is where George's genius came in, the first stage was to go in with open palms and say, look, we're happy to work with you unconditionally. We're not going to stand against you in constituencies. But what they knew was that they weren't bothered about the constituencies. They don't care. They're only interested in those very easy list seats. And the problem with the way the elections work in Holyrood is that if you've got list seats, it's very easy to play a defensive game. It's very hard to play an attacking game, because to push the boat out to win those constituencies, you're going to have to lose a few list seats. And you're going to have to lose a few of your mates. And they don't want to do that. So the next stage, I'm afraid, is to say to them, you are going to lose that, because we are going to stand against you in constituencies and on the list. and in Westminster. And let's face it, some of those majorities, they're not very big. There are a couple of hundred votes in some of those places. And we say to them, all that we ask is that you just leave us alone. Don't threaten IndyRef. Don't sleep with the enemy. Don't prop up local authorities up and down Scotland with SNP Labour coalitions. Yep. That's absurd. You're dealing with a party that literally, its brass plate, its bumper sticker is, we want to destroy the UK, and you're working with them. What are you playing at? How can you admit that this is acceptable? It's disgusting.
It's absolutely, it's shameful, and we see it if you look at any of the council, the makeup of any council seat on mainland Scotland. There isn't one in the overall control of any party right now. So there are a whole series of coalitions, and as John rightly says, there are at least 6 in which the SNP and Labour councillors are working together to keep out the Tories. And
Edinburgh's one of them.
Edinburgh's one of them.
Edinburgh's one of them. There's no reason right now. It doesn't even need the local elections in a couple of months' time. Labour right now could say, do you know what? Yeah, you're right. We need to get off this hamster wheel. We don't like the Tories. Everyone knows we don't like the Tories. But in councils up and down England and in Aberdeen, we are working with them because locally, we just want to make sure that local services work. Because local elections aren't about a Labour government. They're not about a Tory government. They're not about independence. They're actually about relatively little, which never gets discussed.
It's true.
But that's what's so infuriating, that we've had the SNP in power in Edinburgh now for years. The roads are an absolute mess. They really are. And it really is quite vexing when you know that all they have to do is pick up the phone, knock on each other's doors, and it's all over.
Yeah.
They could kick the SNP out of Edinburgh tomorrow. Glasgow, more difficult, but you know that the actual margin between Nats and none isn't that big at all. They did it in Aberdeen. They could do it all across the Central Belt. There's no reason for SNP to be in power in local government in Scotland. It just isn't.
Absolutely right. Agreed. I mean, the numbers bear that out, and you'll know that as part of my tasks these days, I am about to produce a tactical voting guide, or a voting guide for the May elections for the Unionist clubs, which is a group of clubs you and I jointly have helped to shape their political views and makeup, if you like. And so it's a very difficult conversation to have, because what we're effectively saying is, well, guys, members, I think it would be a good idea to vote for these parties, although they're not really going to work together. And so what you're probably going to get at the end of it is much the same as you've got right now, unless we can persuade them to say the parties by saying, look, we're not going to vote for you unless you agree to work together, because that's really all there is to it. Explain to us how it can be that you visualize a situation where you believe the right course of action for councillors, Labour councillors in Edinburgh, is to team up with people who, as you rightly say, are hell-bent on breaking the country apart. And it's not independence, it's secession, it's breaking up the country. John, you'll have heard John, everyone tonight, saying exactly what I say on this show every week. We don't live in a union, we live in a country. The union took place in 1707. Why are we talking about a union? The United States isn't called a union. Only in the president once a year says the State of the Union address. That's it. It's not called a union. You don't get.
I mean, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and people forget this about Northern Ireland. Scotland and Northern Ireland are the only 2 parts of the UK who have voted to stay in the United Kingdom. And
that's a very good point.
And people forget that about the Good Friday Agreement. Good Friday Agreement was very clear. It recognised that Northern Ireland was part of the UK, and you know what? 95% of voters in the Republic of Ireland also accepted that it's part of the United Kingdom. And then we had our referendum. To paraphrase Nicola Sturgeon, we had a referendum against our will. No one ever asked us for it.
Yeah.
No one ever asked David Cameron for it from the Unionist side. It was the Nationalists that were begging for it. No one on the Unionist side wanted a referendum. Why would you? But we've had that. And, you know, there's a very good principle that runs through certainly through British law, but I think also a lot of other countries, and that's something called double jeopardy, where you don't get tried for the same crime twice. You don't keep going back again and again and again until you get a confession or you get a conviction. You know, they effectively had their trial. They waited 80 years for it. There was no reason for them to have it. The British government chose for them to have it. It was voted for in Parliament, all legally. I don't remember the SNP complaining about the fact that it was a Westminster vote to give them a referendum. They were certainly happy about Westminster then. And we've had our vote. We had it 55-45, which is a pretty respectable second place for them. Mm-hmm. But it's done. It's like the Olympics that we're having in Beijing just now. If the curling team hadn't have won, I don't know, maybe Nicola Sturgeon would have demanded that they rerun the curling event against the Swedes. Who knows? Who knows?
Absolutely, it wouldn't surprise me.
If it's going to matter, you can't keep doing it until you get the right answer.
No, you can't. You're absolutely right. Indeed. Juvenile is right. It's the politics of the playground. Right. So one feature of this podcast, John, is that we get live interaction, which is absolutely priceless from people. Now, we've had a request here, which has come through, asking, can we explain the voting system? What is a list seat and what other seats are up for election? Right. Okay, just to say, I'll just field this to start and you can come in subsequently, John. A list seat only exists in the Holyrood elections, guys. So in the Holyrood elections, that's the elections for the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, or the Scottish Local Authority, whatever we want to call it. That's not taking place this year. The Scottish election in Holyrood took place last May. They take place once every 4 years. It was 5 years because of the pandemic. It may be 5 years again. I don't know. Anyway, there's not going to be another election for at least 3 or 4 years. In the Scottish Holyrood elections, you have 56 what they call list seats, and you have 73 constituency seats. The constituency seat is, as we all know it, first past the post. You get a constituency like, for example, Glasgow South Side or Ayr or Edinburgh Central, something like that. That's a constituency, and that's first past the post. Whoever wins most votes, whichever one person wins most votes in that constituency, wins the seat and goes into Holyrood. As John said earlier, the pro-UK parties don't focus so much on the constituencies because they don't win many of them. Now, there are 73 of them, and this time round, the three parties together won 11 seats, which means that the SNP won 62. Now, just think about that. That's 62 out of 73 seats they won. And what percentage of the vote did they take? Did they need to take that? 49.7% was the SNP share of the constituency vote, yet they won 85% of the seats. Now, if you explained that to an average intelligence 4-year-old child, they would say, well, it doesn't really make sense to have three parties standing against them then. Wouldn't it be better to have one party standing against them, which, of course, a blind man could see. But no, the main pro-UK parties decided no, we must offer a range of pro-UK options. Absolute BS, complete rubbish. And of course they got wiped out as a result. But they didn't care, because at the same time, and this is the really bizarre thing, the really ridiculous thing about the Scottish Holyrood elections, you've got the guy who stands in the constituency like Perthshire South, I think was Murdo Fraser's constituency, who is meanwhile also saying North. So I beg your pardon, North. Sorry, and Liz Smith is South. Right? Okay, cool. Right. So Murdo stands, but really goes through the motions. Doesn't really try too hard. Why? Because he's the lead candidate on the list for the Conservatives. So if he doesn't win, he gets a second bite at it, because what the list is each of the 8 regions of Scotland will return 7 what they call regional MSPs, and these guys are voted in. People are voted in by votes going to their party. So in the Scottish Holyrood election, your first vote goes to a person, your second vote goes to a party. So Murdo Fraser and all of these guys in Scotland were going around the country trumpeting their mantra, both votes Tory, both votes Tory. Why? Because it meant that they didn't have to try too hard to win the constituency. And if they didn't win it, no problem. They'd get in via the list instead. So that was the farcical thing we saw. We All for Unity, were trying harder to get Conservative and Labour MSPs elected than they were themselves. It was just grotesque farce. So what we agreed last year was, right, okay, we've tried this. We tried to do the tactical voting thing. They weren't interested. They just wanted to get in via the list. And the reason that the Conservative Party and their supporters on social media were so vehemently anti All for Unity is because they admitted that we would have stopped them getting some of their MSPs elected. I met Jamie Green. I've told the story. I met Jamie Green at the count in Braehead, and he said, "Oh yeah. As soon as you hit 4% in the polls, the word went out. Right, start attacking these guys." He said, "Because if we hadn't, we'd have lost Brian and we'd have lost Rachel." I was like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. You openly encouraged people to vote against the Unionist Party because you didn't want your guys to lose your seats. What kind of? I mean, so this idea that you've got Unionist MSPs in Scotland is a complete myth. You don't at all. You have people who want.
There's a specific thing about the Scottish system, though, as well, and that the way the list seats work is that they're compensatory, which means if you win constituencies, you will start to lose list seats in that electoral region. And so the only way you'll ever be able to make these parties behave themselves is to say, you're going to lose those list seats anyway, because we're going to stand against you. So that's already gone. Don't try and hang on to your list seats. We're going to make sure that you lose them. What you need to focus on is actually taking those constituency seats.
Absolutely right. And this is what we came up with last year. There is no way the Scottish electorate, the pro-UK Scottish electorate, will be fooled ever again into giving votes to one party, because you can see what's happened as a result. The Conservatives made this great play of saying, "We vote for us and we will stop the SNP winning a majority." Right. So let's just do the numbers again. The SNP won 64 out of 129 seats. 64 out of 129, which is a fraction under 50%. And what have we heard from the Conservative Party from day one after the election? We stopped the SNP winning a majority. Brilliant. But the 8 Green MSPs, who are in fact SNP, they're not Green at all, we know they're not, they took the total number of seats for the pro-nationalist parties to 72. Consequently, there is no stopping a majority, as we saw today. What you may not know, because I know a lot of our viewers are in Northern Ireland, there's now, the SNP has introduced a car parking charge for people going to work. You have to park your car at work, you have to pay £1,000 a year for it. The Conservatives today tried to get this stopped, but they couldn't. Why couldn't they? Because the Greens voted with the SNP. So the Conservatives still, as of last week, were saying, we stopped the SNP winning a majority. That means nothing. Less than nothing.
This is a crucial one. When people say, but what happens if Tories or Labour lose their seats? Nothing.
Exactly.
Because you've either got the SNP with a workable majority or you've not. It doesn't matter if that workable majority is 5 or 1, anything. Likewise with the number of MPs they have. I mean, they have what, 56, is it now?
I think it's 48. They've got 48 at the moment. Because because there was 56 elections ago. Yeah,
the GE, But one of the problems you have is that recently there was 56.
That's right.
The first time they got the referendum, there was only 6 of them.
That's right.
So whether it's 6 or 56, it doesn't matter. It doesn't actually, I mean, that's a very strange thing to say, but it really doesn't matter how many SNP MPs there are, because that is not in any way a threat to the United Kingdom. Never has been.
Yeah,
it never has been. You just have a bunch of zombies that line up behind what's his name? Ian Blackford, who just does his usual grotesque gargoyle act. And it doesn't matter how many there are behind them, because they're all just drones. It doesn't matter if there's 47 or 37 or 57. It's never going to be any different. They all say the same script. It's a little bit like the Village of the Damned, really. The kids that all their eyes kind of light up and they're all a little bit zombie-like. But that's what they're like. So the number of MPs you have does not matter. There is always going to be a pro-UK majority in Westminster. That's not a problem. What is a problem is having a working majority in Holyrood, which puts the SNP in government. And it's always about SNP plus Green. It's the same party.
It is the same party. And this is what people have to realise. The Scottish, I don't just say this because It's what I believe. The Scottish Greens are not even affiliated with the UK Greens. They're not the same party. They could call themselves the Scottish Yellows. They could call themselves anything. They happen to have called themselves Greens, and they're getting a lot of votes on that basis because a lot of people in Scotland like to think they're, we're really eco-conscious and all this. Great. So they vote for these absolute clowns. Name me another green or ecologically aware party in the world which also doubles up as being nationalist. I mean, it's utterly ludicrous.
There certainly aren't many.
Absolutely.
It's not a green. It's not a green party anyway.
Not exactly.
Even on the parking charges, this again. The problem with the Tories in Scotland is that they don't fundamentally disagree with the SNP on anything. Actually, they tend to disagree on the pace of travel and the extent of it, but the direction of travel is always the same. It's all very well opposing the idea of parking your car. Oh, that's terrible. All right, but it's the Tories that want to ban petrol and diesel cars. It's true. The Tories that actually charge 60 pence a litre on your fuel and have done for over a decade. So the idea of, want of a better phrase, screwing the motorist isn't a problem for the Tories. They just don't want anyone else to do it.
He's right.
It doesn't make any sense. It's not as if the Tories are pro-motorist and think you should be able to park your car anywhere and drive at a sensible speed through town. They don't. As I said, they are not fundamentally different to the SNP. They just don't push things quite as far. They just don't smell quite as bad.
True. Absolutely true. And absolutely maddening for us guys in Scotland. I mean, the idea that you're going to have gas and oil prices going through the roof, which they have done already and are going to continue to do so, at the same time that the SNP has decided, oh no, we don't want any pollutant fossil fuels anymore. Okay, that's a great idea, but doesn't that just mean you're going to have to import very expensive gas and oil rather than use the stocks off our shores while it lasts? So utterly bizarre. Really, they have no logical thinking beyond, okay, we want independence and we're progressive, so we better say things that look a wee bit ecologically sound.
This isn't the SNP of the 1970s and 80s, for which you may be surprised I actually have a little bit of respect for. People like Gordon Wilson. I read a beautiful debate between Gordon Wilson and Tony Benn debating the finer points of Dounreay and having a British nuclear power reactor. And it was clear that these people were educated. It's clear that many people, and this was true of Labour, actually had a kind of engineering or mechanical background. Almost, I don't think there's a single scientist in Holyrood. I don't think there's a single one. And if you can't even add up, if you can't multiply things by 10 or 100 or 1,000, you're not fit to run a corner shop or a carry-out. You're certainly not fit to run any kind of even regional government that has a long-term strategy, because they haven't got a clue what they're doing. They obsess over wind power. And I think for the simple reason that if you hold up a toy windmill to them and just spin it around a little bit, they kind of understand what it means. I think that's why they like wind power. They can get their head around it just about. If you try and talk to them about anything more advanced than that, whether it's nuclear power or coal or tidal power, even that, they just don't seem to get it. So you're not having a genuine debate. It's like having a debate with a 4-year-old child. It might be entertaining, but it's probably not that useful, all being told.
Absolutely right. I mean, you can see the ranks of the SNP MSPs in Holyrood. So many of them are either career politicians, or else they're even worse, they're straight out of university and then maybe into council for one term and then into Holyrood. And these are people who clearly have no experience of life. They clearly have no experience of even living elsewhere in the UK. And so they're talking all this absolute hogwash. And they can... Go on, John.
I think when you've got a nationalist government in charge, which is nihilistic and does not want the United Kingdom to succeed,
indeed,
we have a very big problem here. And this is a little surprise some people, but it's the Barnett Formula and how it works and why. The Barnett Formula worked before devolution because the Scotland office didn't play favourites. It didn't need to. It just looked at all of Scotland. Since devolution, Labour and the SNP do play favourites, and they have bought themselves a very, very large coterie of fake charities, fake organisations, the third sector. And that's where they spend the Barnett Formula money. So they're being raised in this world where they're getting more money than their economy will ever have to raise. Now, if you have people that are so-called independence-minded, that's really not a good mindset for them to grow up with, because just like a cuckoo in a nest, they'll just keep tweeting and they'll just keep begging for more, and the cycle will never stop. And the more you feed them, the angrier they get, because obviously you haven't fed them enough. The very fact that you've fed them more means there must be even more around the corner. It just shows how mean you are. The very fact that you're giving them a little bit more shows that actually you're really mean, because really there must be a lot more around the corner. And so we've gone from a position in about 20 years where our health budget used to be about 20% higher than England's, but it's dropped. It's only about 3% higher than England now. It's almost the same. And once you factor in things like free prescriptions and a couple of other kind of freebies that they've chucked in, for that extra 15% spending that Scotland gets publicly, we're not getting 15% more in our schools. We're not getting 15% more in our NHS at all. It's all kind of sloshing over the sides, engorging this kind of big beast that we're feeding. One point on that before a break, in Scotland, there's 100 fake charities now whose job is to help you cycle to work, particularly if you're cycling less than 5 miles to work. 100 different organizations. There's bikes for women, there's bikes for refugees. You know, they actually got here without a bike, but they obviously need a bike now. There's bikes for Aberdeen, bikes for, doesn't matter. And they've got £500,000 over the last year, £400,000. And that's just riding a bike to work. And they've managed to make up 400 grand for that. When it comes to the equality network, which isn't equality at all, it's just the kind of the LGBT networks, they're sucking in a couple of £1 million a year. And you think, we're only 5.5 million people. If this was UK wide, this would be like Stonewall getting what? This would be like Stonewall getting £40 million a year. That's the scale up. It's really bizarre how much money that's meant for vulnerable people is finding its way into basically friends of Nippy.
It's quite staggering, isn't it? It is absolutely ridiculous. The comments coming in here. Peter Morris is one of my real strong supporters on this platform, and he's been on. He's graced us with his presence a number of times. He's saying that there is no equality for men and boys. We're left behind as we don't help their radical feminist narrative, and he's absolutely right. So yeah, I mean the fact that we
go further than that, I actually don't even think they're radical feminists anymore. I think it's much darker than that. I think we're into some very strange identity politics, and I think we've only seen the start of it. I actually get a lot of support for my comments from a lot of what I would call real feminists. Maybe you would call them second or third wave feminists, who actually are deeply concerned in the erosion of women's rights, and particularly with a lot of the kind of gender legislation that's coming through in Scotland now, are actually quite horrified by how the movement has turned. So I actually would sort of speak up for feminists there and say they're actually not anywhere near the kind of challenge we think they are. In many ways, they're actually on our side. They're also very, very concerned about, again, the what I would call the fake sector and the identity politics that grows from within it, because actually it's very misogynistic.
Very much so.
We don't say that very often, but actually a lot of this transgender stuff is rank misogyny dressed up. I would like to say rank misogyny and drag, but I'd probably get in trouble for that.
Oh, you'd be labelled a TERF, and that's the thing. This idea that if you're, the number one insult aimed by nationalists and progressives these days is TERF. So either it was Tory, it's now TERF, and of course that means trans exclusionary radical feminist. So they're using feminist as a pejorative term, so, as an insult. And so I don't think you were there, John. Niall Fraser and Pete Morris and a few others were there outside Holyrood. I can't remember if you were there or not. Anyway, it was the Women Won't Wheesht protest, right? And there were about 2,000 or 3,000 women there. Primarily, I would have to say there were a lot of LGBT and rainbow flags and women who gave the impression they were of that in particular bent, and that's absolutely fine. But the fact that you've got women, particularly lesbians, standing up for their own rights and being mislabeled as TERFs because of that, they were only saying, hang on, since when did women's rights become a problem? And in fairness, the Conservative MSPs, pretty much to a man and woman, stood outside and pressed the flesh and introduced themselves, and I met a couple of them that day. It was fine. All the SNP MSPs were inside looking out the window, practically making faces and calling them names in the chamber. They were referred to as fascists.
We've almost gone back to witch burning, haven't we, really?
Absolutely, indeed.
I would say in Westminster, the Tories do fund Stonewall. They're no fan of social conservatism at all.
Right, interesting, right.
Yeah, I mean, Liz Truss, right up there, one of the biggest backers of Stonewall there is. And of course, Boris's latest wife, she's a big Stonewall fan.
Well, that's what matters, obviously. Whatever Boris's wife thinks,
that's really all that matters, and has done for quite a while. But one of the things that you get with nationalism, I've often talked about narcissism and collective narcissism as being the basis for nationalism. You get this brutalization, particularly of what we would maybe think as traditionally more vulnerable groups. Yep. They don't think twice about brutalizing women. Doesn't matter whether it's Sarah Smith or whether it's a woman that simply doesn't want a man to walk into a toilet after. They aren't criticized, they are brutalized. And we know, and I think we need to talk a little bit more about the problem the SNP has with women and the brutalization that's gone on, certainly within the party as well. There's a great many female victims that Nicola Sturgeon has not been quite aware of at the time.
Indeed.
It seems to be a growing theme this over the last few years, that she actually does have a problem with women.
Well,
she has a problem with keeping women safe.
Absolutely. I mean, I have an opinion, which is I think Nicola Sturgeon has a major problem with happy, settled, if you like, out lesbian women. She has a genuine problem. She could not abide Ruth Davidson. Ruth Davidson pressed her buttons like nobody else ever has. She didn't like Kezia Dugdale. She certainly doesn't like Joanna Cherry. And you think, hang on, what do these women have in common? Are they all Jewish? No.
I mean, obviously, if you those that don't know, I mean, I tend not to agree with Ruth Davidson on many things, but this whole slogan they came out with which was called "Rape Clause Ruth."
That's right.
Blaming Ruth Davidson for the so-called rape clause that didn't even exist.
Yeah.
I mean, to say to a woman that you are tantamount to supporting rapists, or you're tantamount to supporting the chastisement of rape victims, that's disgusting.
Yeah.
And that streak of bile runs through the SNP like a stick of rock. And they will turn on their own as well. But there's a real poison that's in there. One of the things you find with with narcissists, is they have a real difficulty in distinguishing themselves from other. If anything goes wrong, they want to blame other people. They have very fragile egos. And one of the things you find is that what narcissists can't do is they cannot accept psychologically any flaw within themselves. That means they don't have any humility. If you notice with the nationalists, they never smile or laugh unless it's at the idea of someone else suffering. You notice that they have no sense of humor that's genuine because they can't self-deprecate. They can't criticize themselves. And that means they can't reflect. It means they can't learn. It means that the more they carry on, it tends to be the worse and worse they get until something external stops them, i.e. they're booted out of office. But until then, they'll actually just get worse and worse. It's a very toxic and destructive cycle in anyone, but in anyone that's in charge of safeguarding vulnerable people, it's especially toxic.
We all saw that 2 years ago when the treatment of Scotland's elderly was just utterly it was barbaric. It was beyond criminal. It was murderous. The idea that they would deliberately, willfully move COVID positive tested people into care homes. Whereupon
it's more than that, because we had a former nurse speaking in Holyrood a few months earlier than that, who actually was quite open about the idea that actually if more of these people died, it would kind of help, because obviously when you have a very statist, very state-centric health service, which is very politicized, you don't have patients, you just have obstacles. The money's already there, the service is already there, and if you're ill, you're just getting in the way.
Yeah,
you're making those A&E figures worse. They'll come out with things like, and I couldn't believe a chief science and chief medical officer would sanction a statement like this. But they said, don't go to A&E unless it's an emergency, unless it's a life-threatening emergency.
Life-threatening, they said, exactly.
I would say, well, first of all, how do you know? Exactly. And secondly, I would, given that I've worked in A&Es before as a doctor, I would say you want to get there before it becomes life-threatening. Because if it's life-threatening, well, you're pretty likely to die. If you get there before it's life-threatening, you're very likely to survive. So there is no economy at all, and there's a little bit of malice in actually telling people don't seek medical help. People are very good judges of their own health, and if someone is ill for whatever reason, they'll understandably seek help. I mean, one of the things that struck me was, if you think about a broken leg or a broken wrist, they're not life-threatening, but you're not going to walk around with a broken wrist for a week, are you? Or maybe you are.
Absolutely.
Making appointments and dropping on a Sunday afternoon after you've broken your wrist on a Monday. That's going to be good, isn't it?
Exactly. So no, that was quite one of the many utterly deplorable statements made during the whole pandemic. But the idea that, like you say, how are you supposed to know whether it's life-threatening? You don't know. I remember one time I had the most severe pain in my left arm I've ever had, and it was like my left arm was trying to give birth. It was agony. I had no idea what it was. I was lying in bed and it came on, and I'd suffered it for about a day and a half. Then I had to phone up whatever the 111, whatever the number is, and they said, okay. I said, I'm worried it might be a heart attack. He said, how long have you had it? He said, I said, well, about 36 hours. He said, it's not a heart attack, then you'd be dead by now if it was. And I thought, great, okay, thanks. Thanks for the flippancy.
That's actually not true.
There you go. Anyway, thanks, mate. Yeah, but that's what he said. So anyway, turned out it was like something nerve trapped or something like that. Anyway, agony. So, but I had no idea what it was. Am I supposed to not go because I think it's only a pain in my arm, therefore I won't go?
If you are a 75-year-old man and you suddenly have extreme pain in your upper back, that could be heartburn, that could be a spinal tumor, actually, although less likely. That could be an aneurysm that's splitting in half. It could be all manner of things, because when you get to a certain age, a bit like a car, all sorts of things go wrong. And usually when one thing goes wrong, another one does too. So it's a very brave person that over the end of the phone will say, oh, you'll be fine. You'll be all right.
Quite, yes.
Or you'll be dead, in which case no one will ever know.
Indeed. So lots of more comments coming in. Pete Morris again makes the point that at that meeting, that maybe the outside Holyrood, yes, the Conservative MSPs came out and spoke to people who were women. As soon as the second protest took place, which was a protest against the treatment of Scotland's school kids, they all scarped and went inside. And Pete's saying this was maybe cynical because women get votes and children don't. But we all know the SNP's treatment of children, as we've seen just this week. Blackford and Sturgeon are both appalled at Boris Johnson for ending COVID lockdown measures, and they feel that this is taking unnecessary chances and reckless. And in the same breath, Nicola Sturgeon is asking 13 and 14-year-old children, oh, have you tried anal sex? No, you really should. It's great, you know. So, I mean, who are we kidding here? The way that children are being treated by the SNP is just, it's not even, it's not short of paedophile.
I've written for quite a while on that idea of, just a second. Yeah. Yeah, I've written for quite a while on that idea of the idea of the sexualization of children in the SNP, and it started with the transgender debate in schools. And I knew that the moment they started bringing that into schools, they were going to start talking about the age of consent and trying to lower it. And what they're doing, of course, is they're doing it in the sleek it way, because we know paedophiles are sleek it. That's their nature. Yeah. They're doing it in the sleek it way of saying, oh, well, you know, if it happens, we won't tell your mum, we won't tell your dad, we'll just obstruct justice, which is what they're doing. It is the obstruction of justice if you fail to report a crime and you fail to report grooming. Then again, Derek Mackay.
Yeah.
They never condemned him. He's never apologised. He's set up a management consultancy. I think he was going to call it Derek Mackay and Sons, but the obvious question would be whose sons. I think he's given it some made-up rubbish name. But you know that that's how he's minded, and his hand is going to be in the till. They're going to try and create some kind of consultancy work for him, and they'll feed him money via the Scottish government. And of course, what do Tory MSPs say about all that? Oh, well, he's made mistakes. We all have to move on, you know.
Exactly. Let's face it, it's not just the SNP saying that. Murdo Fraser said that.
It's so-called opposition MSPs that are saying, oh, you know, these things happen, you know.
Exactly.
Yep. Move on, you know.
Well, exactly. I mean, I can't remember who it was last week said. It wasn't Murdo Fraser. It was somebody had said.
Andrew Wilson said it as well.
Andrew Wilson. He's the first guy, and then Murdo said this might be unpopular, but it's also true. Funny you should say about the nationalists never looking happy. The only photograph I've ever seen of Nicola Sturgeon looking happy is when she was in the chamber, and there was obviously a little break in proceedings, and she was talking to somebody had their back to the camera, and there was Nicola Sturgeon and Derek Mackay, and Derek Mackay was talking very animatedly, and I've never seen Nicola Sturgeon look as happy, and I'm just dread to think what he was telling her. You know, I'm wondering whether he was thinking, well, was this really cute 16-year-old boy? Well, yeah, was he, Derek? Well, it sounds great. You know, God knows. But anyway, it's beyond sick. But every time anyone says something about Derek Mackay in a positive manner, I always ask the same question. Say, if that's how you feel, have you got any photographs of any of your 16-year-old male relatives? Because if so, could you post them? Because I've got a gay friend who's really likes some dates, and let's face it, it's not illegal. So just you can put the full photos out. That'd be really helpful. Thanks. So suddenly they become less interested in defending.
They're also very uncaring, and because you actually have to recognise your own weaknesses and vulnerabilities to care and actually grow as people. Everyone has to do that. We're all vulnerable. But again, they won't do that because they can't countenance the idea that there's any flaw within them. And so they are uncaring. But I would challenge anybody, when you talk to a nationalist who's an activist, when's the last time they actually made you laugh? I bet it was at someone else's expense.
Yeah.
It will be the idea of, it's Schadenfreude. That's really the only time they ever show any kind of smile or laughter. It's only when someone else is suffering.
Well,
it's almost as if they need that idea of suffering, that narcissistic supply to keep them going.
Wow, could be. I mean, today, for example, classic Sturgeon today. What's his name? God, he's such a presence. I forgot his name. Douglas Ross. Douglas Ross says something about, 2 weeks ago it was reckless, and today you're doing it. You're copying Boris Johnson. Why is this? Surely you shouldn't be. Why did you criticise him and then go and copy him? Sturgeon, of course, says, I will take no lectures from you. Why would you have a go at me about criticising Boris Johnson when you're trying to make him lose his job? And this is the problem. One, Ross is such a political lightweight, is the only word for it, that you would allow himself to fall into that trap. And secondly, Sturgeon just has to say, well, why would I listen to you? You're a Tory. Why should I listen to you? Ruth Davidson is what she said in the lead up to the election. You're going to the House of Lords. Why would we listen to you? And this is what it's like. It's like everything's just dismissive. It's just not interested in what you think. You can't possibly question me. Do you know who I am? And she's becoming more and more authoritarian, more and more dictatorial.
The problem with that is that once you know that's what they're like,
yeah.
I mean, it's like a box of chocolates. You've got to deal with what you get, right? So if you know that's what she's like, you can't make yourself hostage to fortune.
No.
There's no point hampering yourself. The reason that he did that with Boris is because everything the Scottish Tories does is about a turf war within the Tory party.
Absolutely.
That's all it's ever been. And, you know, they get up and they talk about breaking away, and they talk about, oh, maybe we'll have to go our own, you know, what's it called? Navigate our own channel. Forget it. Forget it. They couldn't get themselves out of a brown paper bag on their own. This is all about a wider turf war within the party. And that's, as I keep saying it, their focus is Westminster. They really see Holyrood purely in terms of being a liability, and their party behaves in that way. I can tell you now, there's no hunger whatsoever in the Tory party to be part of a government in Scotland. And if you're not willing to do that, then what are you doing?
What's the point?
What's the point? Well, it's worse than that, because you're stopping people that will be more than happy to be in government and you know, have ideas for government. They don't have any. Ask them. I mean, I would challenge any of them, any MSP right now in the Tory party, give me a 2-minute speech about what you would do positively once you were in government. You wouldn't get them past 30 seconds.
Agreed. Because, I mean, let's face it, all they want to do there is serve 2 terms, and then if they're lucky, maybe get a place in the House of Lords, or certainly get a nice pension. So either way, it will do, and it will get them onto some...
Again, the SNP have only ever learned from the Tories in the kind of stunts that they pull. So with the Tories, you either go to the Lords, or you get some fake job being head of the commission for things. Or you get a directorship like making Baxter's soup or something like that. It's always some kind of wheeze or other. There's always some fake job, usually in the private sector or in the establishment of the government in the Lords. The SNP don't have those means available, so they've made their own House of Lords up, which is the third sector.
Yes.
That's the House of Lords. That's where your failed and old nationalist politicians go. That's why Jean Freeman rocks up in some fake university post, because what I imagine will have happened is the university's gone, can we have some money, please? And the SNP will have said, of course you can. By the way, we need a job for Jean. They couldn't do that with Derek, so you know, he'll have to find his own funds. But we've seen it before. We saw it, I think, with Stephen Gethins over in North East Fife. He rocks up in some position in the University of St Andrews. That's just what they do, and the Tories do the same thing. So turn up, do nothing, keep the seat warm, play a defensive game, disappear south, and House of Lords, some directorship, some made up rubbish. But what they don't want to do is govern, which means they want the SNP to govern. So what are they doing? They're just helping the SNP if they're not opposing them.
Absolutely right. Indeed. Right. Well, an hour has passed. As I said it would, it goes very quickly.
It did.
Many thanks for joining us. What I wanted to ask you just before I let you go, John, is what is your advice for the pro-UK Scottish electorate, the majority, the silent majority, if you like, for this May? How would you tell them to cast their votes? What would your advice be?
It's a very difficult one, but what I would say is this. I would challenge the parties very openly to rule out any support of a nationalist administration. If Labour won't do that, don't vote Labour. Just don't. You might as well vote SNP, because they're working with them. And if you get any literature from the Tories through the post, or you see any interview and they talk about independence, don't vote for them. But actually, send them an email. Say, I'm not voting for you because I'm sick of this. I'm sick of the blackmail. I'm sick of the laziness. I'm sick of this lack of hunger to govern better. And I suppose after then, you just have to choose whoever you think's best. It might be a local independent person. It might be someone from one of the smaller parties. The idea that, oh, well, if we vote for them, you'll waste your vote. Well, if you vote to back the SNP via Labour, or you vote to carry on Indy through the Tories, you're definitely wasting your vote. In fact, you're really voting against yourself if you do either of those. So
Can't argue with that.
It's really up to the Tories and Labour what they want to do. If they want to stop the games, it's fine.
Yep, but we need to.
The games.
Exactly. We need to see some evidence from them that is indeed what they do plan. And at the moment, that evidence is rather thin on the ground. So anyway, right. Well, we shall wrap it up there. Can I just thank everybody for the interaction tonight and the messages? Too many to read out as always. Thanks very much again, Pete Morris, William Torrance, all you guys. Really, really appreciate you coming on. John, thank you for taking time out from your busy yeast-making schedule to join us, and the very best of luck. And remember, I want to get an invite to the opening night whenever it happens.
You're very welcome. Very, very welcome.
Excellent, excellent. So thanks again, John, and we'll speak again, hopefully, before May or else after May, and you can give us your thoughts then. Would that be okay?
Perfect. All right.
Fantastic. Okay, many thanks, John. Thank you very much, and good night, everyone. Speak to you again next week.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
There are any number of issues in Scotland that need addressing. Health, education, drug deaths, the economy, but all of those are taking a back seat at this conference to one issue above all else, and that's an independence referendum.
Scotland doesn't want a Boris Johnson government. It doesn't want to leave the European Union, and it wants to be able to determine its own future, whatever that future turns out to be. And this idea that the Tories can just say no and sort of imprison Scotland in a union against its will, I just don't think will hold.
Independence is what the SNP is all about, and Nicola Sturgeon is expected to reinforce that massively at this conference. There will be no chance for people who are against the First Minister's policies to get a hearing.